To our first Civic Life Lunch of the semester. My name is Jen McAndrew. I work here at Tisch College as the Director of Communication Strategy and Planning, also a proud Tufts grad. And we are joined today by Sabrina Cartan, who specializes in mobilizing online fan communities for social justice, change, and civic causes. She is the current co-president of the Board of Directors of Fandom Forward and host of their podcast, which has the amazing name Shireside Chats, as well as the director of digital strategy at Potomac Productions, where she works with the one and only iconic Wonder Woman actor, singer, and activist Linda Carter, who recently mentioned Sabrina on the Today Show. And if you haven't seen that clip, you can check out Sabrina's Facebook page. Together, they have co-created innovative ways to mobilize fans on issues like women's rights, LGBTQ plus equality, ending voter suppression, climate justice, and anti-racist advocacy. So Sabrina, thank you. Welcome back to campus. Sabrina is a proud jumbo as well, and thank you so much for being here. It's a particular pleasure for me to welcome back Sabrina because I've had the privilege of knowing her for many years since she was an intern, actually through Tisch College as a early Tisch Summer Fellow in the office of Congresswoman Catherine Clark, where I used to work when Sabrina was an intern. So we're here to tackle the topic of fan activism, and it's really a fitting topic for us to kick off the speaker series and our Civic Life Lunches with, because our theme this spring is citizen activism. And so throughout all our events, which I hope you will join us for, we're looking forward to speaking to the question of what each of us can do individually and together in this moment for change. So Sabrina, welcome. And let's just start with a very basic question that can have some very nuanced answers, which is, what is fan activism and what does it mean to you?
Well, hello, that was a mouthful of a bio. So I just wanted to
know.
That's the short version.
Yeah.
I know if I talked about everything I wanted to talk about, we would be here all day. So I will just say a couple things before I answer your question.
Yeah.
One, I'm so excited to see you. If you don't know Jen that well, she's a wonderful mentor, a great friend. She plucked me out of obscurity when I was, 19 years old, and she saw my potential. And I'm sure she does that now with so many amazing Tufts students. And I'm just really excited to be here in conversation.
Thank you, that's very sweet. Please mention me on the Today Show.
Yeah, oh, of course.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I want to say is thank you all for being here, because I remember being, especially for the students, not the professors, because I haven't been in your shoes, but except for, I guess, right now. But as students, you're kind of moving from one thing to the next, and you probably are thinking about that test that you have later this afternoon or the lecture that you have. And the one thing I wish I had done while I was here is really try to savor these types of moments. And like, even if it's just the mac and cheese, and that's the best thing about, this afternoon, like savor the moment that you're in, because so much of what I experienced here was wonderful and also completely lost to the ages. So thank you all for being here. To answer the question of what is fan activism, you have to understand what a fan is. Now, taking a step back and talking about fandom, there's this idea that this assumption that fandom is synonymous with consumerism, which it can be. A fan can be someone who goes to see the latest Marvel movie or Star Wars movie, and maybe they buy a t-shirt or a lightsaber or something, and that's the extent to which they are a fan. To me, fandom is the spectrum from that basic level of consumerism all the way up to creativity and creating transformative work. In the academic study of fandom, the idea of transformative work means that you are remixing and reinterpreting and putting your own spin and seeing your own life in the context of a story like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or Marvel. I wrote something very specific that I wanted to read here. There's a level of creativity and imagination in fandom that goes beyond consumerism. What is a story to you at this point in your life? And what did it mean to you when you were small? Is a story something that you collect just for now, like that band t-shirt that will inevitably wind up at Goodwill? Or is it a story that will become a part of you forever? Everyone has seen that one movie or read that one book or played that one video game or listened to that one artist and remembered how that first experience made them feel. And all of the magic that exists in that for you as a person, that is where fan activism comes into play. And to me, the definition of fan activism is tapping into that emotion and passion to enact social change.
Amazing, thank you. And you have done that, and we're going to hear about that. You mentioned stories and tapping into stories. And I think one of the best parts of events like this, especially the lunch series, is really hearing our guests' stories. And so I'm hoping you could maybe briefly encapsulate or tell us your own personal fan activism story. What was that spark for you? How did you get involved with civic efforts around a fan community? And maybe where did that take you?
Recording in progress. So I think that my personal story really connects to what's so great about fan activism. In preparing this talk, wanted to think of the most sophisticated way to frame everything, because, you know, with all of my favorite professors here, I was really striving to get an A, which is a normal thing to want when you're pushing 30.
Classic tough student.
But I think at the end of the day, it was a very simple framework. Fandom Forward, which is the organization I work with, used to be called the Harry Potter Alliance, or the HPA. And when I was 18 years old, I heard of the Harry Potter Alliance, and I said to myself, it's a Harry Potter organization that is doing good in the world, and I want to be a part of that. It was as simple as that. That framing and that branding was interesting to me because I lived and breathed Harry Potter at the time. We'll talk a little bit more about my journey and why I don't now, for pretty obvious reasons, I think. But yeah, for the most part, it was just that I was new to activism. I did not grow up in a very politically engaged family. My parents voted, but they would take me to vote with them to show me the importance of voting, but they weren't, you know, they didn't go to like school board meetings. They didn't talk about politics so much. You know, to me, they kind of were like the average American, in the sense that they don't live and breathe it, and they don't, you know, do activism. They're not like super active in their communities, but they're nice people. And so when I started working with the Harry Potter Alliance, one thing was that I learned a lot about different ways to organize activists towards a particular cause. But the other thing was sort of becoming a part of this network and making all of these friends who would teach me so much about all of the different ways that one could organize sustainably. Like, I think the question of mental health and burnout is a really big problem for activists. And one of the core beliefs of Fandom Forward and many fan activists is that you have to do what Adrienne Marie Brown calls pleasure activism. So you have to make it sustainable through pleasure, because, you know, the joy and the pleasure of it is really the point. Like, what is the point of doing this if you're just going to be tired and burnt out and not able to take care of yourself while you are doing this work? And I had a great conversation with the person, I was going to say the person who taught me about pleasure activism was an unknown woman named Emma Watson, who I spoke with at TED, the TED Climate Change Summit, about this. And, you know, as I started to learn more about pleasure activism, I was able to connect that back to fan activism and say, activism is essentially pleasure activism.
Thank you for that. So for those of us who are just getting to know this topic or sort of getting interested in it, can you give us a couple examples outside of your own experience, maybe, of like your favorite examples of fan activism?
Sure. One of the more recent ones, I mean, it's part of Fandom Forward, but I'll say I didn't really participate so much because it's not one of my fandoms. I don't know how many of you here have seen Our Flag Means Death. It's known as the gay pirate show on HBO. And it has a very, very like fervent growing fandom. It's probably one of the fastest growing fan communities that I've seen in recent years, other than like Stranger Things. But we put together, or rather the community put together, and I kind of watched and cheerled along the way, this campaign called Our Flag Means Queer Rights around Pride last month. And what that meant was we put together like this week of programming where we had different talks and events on Zoom around the world where people were joining to talk about the themes of Our Flag Means Death as it relates to LGBT rights and LGBT mental health and different concerns within different LGBTQ communities. And we had Vico Ortez, who's one of the cast members of the show, join to do a conversation with us. But the most important thing was that in between all of these different talks and like, you know, content programming, there were these action steps that people took to engage in fan activism. I believe it was something like 400 fans came together to take 1,200 actions, like making calls to their elected officials or writing letters to legislative offices to oppose anti-LGBTQ legislation, which is significant because in 2023 alone, the ACLU has reported that there are 124 anti-LGBTQ bills targeting queer and trans youth. And it's like not even March yet, like calm down, you know, but that's the reality of it. We're going up against this concerted effort for, you know, queer and trans lives to become illegal or even further marginalized. And so this was just one of my favorite campaigns because it's a new fandom and it spoke to like directly to an issue that is one of the biggest problems for that audience and for us as Americans.
Amazing, thank you. So you've kind of touched on my next set of questions already, but I think it's worth getting into a little bit. Sort of at the risk of oversimplifying this sort of genre of activism, there seems to be sort of two major strands to fan activism, the sort of like niche track and then the broader activism. So on the one hand, there are like issues, causes, and campaigns that are really closely related to the interests of the fans themselves. So like fans or players from a sport organizing for change in their own sport, or a video game community advocating for gender diversity in the characters of the game, like some with a really sort of specific organizing purpose. And then there are the broader efforts, some of what you've spoken to already, when fans sort of seek to organize and mobilize each other behind a broader cause, LGBTQ rights, climate justice, or even behind a candidate in some cases.
Right.
And so I guess I have a couple questions. One is, first of all, am I making up that dynamic? Do you see that dynamic? Or is that not a good way to delineate fan activism? And I guess a follow-on would be, do you see like relative strengths or challenges to those types of movements?
Right. So I don't necessarily delineate fan activism along the lines that you've described. I think it's a great way to segment these different kinds of projects. I would say that I think about it as more of, is the fan activist campaign, is the fan object. So a fan object is like, it's weird to objectify, I don't want to say a person as an object, but a fan object in the speak of academic fandom is, you know, a celebrity or a book or a movie. So to me, the question is, what is the fan object? And I also think that, you know, in the question of what works and what doesn't, the strength of campaigns really depends on what the fan object is. So for campaigns where, you know, fans of BTS or Taylor Swift or Beyonce or any, you know, sort of band or icon are engaging in fan activism because they love that person. They have a what's called a parasocial relationship to that person. They have like all these emotions that, you know, they have crushes and they have like, they feel like Taylor Swift they could be their best friend. That sort of feeling, that's one kind of engagement. The other thing to me is, the other type to me is if there's a story like Star Wars and you have fans come together to start, you know, making meaning of what the story is, regardless of who the creator is, regardless of what they've been doing and saying. That to me is, I think, more along the lines of what Fandom Forward does and also where I've seen the most impact.
Interesting, thank you. So sort of picking up on Fandom Forward a little bit, formerly the Harry Potter Alliance, as you mentioned. you know, I'd love for you to say a little bit more about that organization,
Sure.
what they're doing now, and I guess sort of also how an organization like that grows and then deals with that growth.
Yeah, so Fandom Forward was founded right here actually in the Medford Somerville area in 2005. And one of the co-founders is actually a Tufts alum named Paul DeGeorge, who is the lead singer of Harry and the Potters. There's a whole world behind all of this. There's a genre of music called wizard rock, and it kind of, the Harry Potter Alliance came out of these partnerships where there were concerts to raise money for, I believe it was Darfur. There was something going on with that particular campaign, an issue at the time where Harry and the Potters performed, and they did like blue balls and concerts in the area, and they would raise money for different causes, right? I think one of the first partners was Amnesty International or UNICEF. It was a very long time ago, and it was before my time with the organization. But from this area of the world came, this whole ecosystem. Fandom Forward didn't invent fan activism. I would say that like the Star Trek fandom in the 1960s, when they would do letter writing campaigns to put the show back on the air, that to me is one of the earlier forms of modern fan activism. But Fandom Forward is certainly like the largest and most kind of like overarching organization that represents fan activists. Our motto is we turn fans into heroes. We make pop culture, we make activism accessible through pop culture. Again, that was for many, many years a Harry Potter focused endeavor. And I know you have a question about why that is. I don't know if you want me to talk about it.
Sure, let's do that now.
Yeah. So J.K. Rowling, I'm not going to say too much about her except that, you get to a point where you realize that the things that you love about a particular story, in this case, Harry Potter, have been outweighed by the damage that someone has done, and that, maybe supporting the official brand is not the best idea anymore. So with Fandom Forward, we're really sort of coalition based or like very collaborative. It's not that as a board member, I am sort of speaking from the top down to everyone else and saying, we need to rebrand because X, Y, and Z. After about 17 years of fan activism under the name Harry Potter Alliance, we wound up surveying the community, which is 100,000 members around the world and different chapters and organizations. And the people who participated, some people just wanted to do Harry Potter campaigns. But most people really were okay with moving in a different direction. And that's not even just because, of J.K. Rowling. I think it's because, we saw that everything we had done was so successful with this one story that you could really take it in a million different directions, or take the model of what worked on different campaigns and see how that applies to Marvel and Star Wars and different stories like those. And so, yeah, we've been expanding. We did a Marvelous Mental Health Month where I think we had an actor from the movie Shang-Chi who did a talk with us about mental health care and trauma with the story, the blip, like the 2 years, that's the 2 years into something that happened to us very recently, right? So those are the kinds of conversations that we're having now. And there's a campaign that I'm working on. I can't say too much about it, but Abigail Disney recently made a film about she's the Disney heiress. She's Roy Disney's granddaughter, one of the Disney heiresses. And she made a film about labor rights at Disney. So I'm very excited to be collaborating with her on an upcoming fan activist project. And yeah, I mean, all I can say, I could talk all day about Fandom Forward, but at the end of the day, we just try to be a hub for any fan activist who believes in human rights and believes in progressive causes. And we don't support particular political candidates, but we do support legislation that furthers reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights, and teaching Black history in schools, and you know, all of the major problems that you know, especially young people are facing today in schools.
Thank you for that. Super interesting. I want to talk a little bit about politics now, and I want to ask specifically about an idea you touched on, which is celebrities and their own efforts to organize their fans for civic action. I'm going to read something. So last fall, on October 19th, Taylor Swift posted this on her Instagram story. It's time to vote early. There are only 20 midnights until the 2022 United States midterm elections on November 8th. And she went on to post that if you're in Tennessee, which is her home state, you can cast your ballot through November 3rd at early voting sites. Waits are usually shorter than on election day. Most states offer some type of early voting. Register to vote and find early voting locations in your state at vote.org. Now, since we are here at Tisch College, I do have to mention Circle, which is one of our major research organizations here, really the preeminent organization understanding youth voting, and note a few things about Taylor's post. First of all, that she included helpful and specific information about voting in the post and a call to action to her mostly young fans. And that in previous elections, most notably the 2018 midterms, our research team and other research teams around the country found that her social media nudges in particular actually demonstrably move the needle on voter registration, especially in her home state of Tennessee. So I want to get your thoughts. I've been really eager to ask you on how and when you think these type of celebrity endorsements of some kind of cause or action can be most effective. And I guess I would say should be structured. Your opinion.
Right. Well, I'm a Swiftie myself, so I was really, really into that. It kind of goes back to what I was saying about the difference between like the person who's a fan because they love a person versus a person who's a fan because they love a story, right? And sometimes that there's an intermix of that. But I think that when celebrities engage, the most effective strategies tend to be less like this is a person who's performing for everyone else and more like about creating a community. Like I think of someone like, you know, Linda Carter as a really great dinner host, right? With a table of millions of people. And you're not just trying to get fans to talk to you or be interested in what you're doing. You're going to get them to talk to each other and to build a community and build meaning, make meaning and discover new things about the activism that they want to do and what their values are. Because you are the curator of that. And someone who has inspired that in other people. What you said about Taylor Swift providing very specific, direct, like actionable, like SMART goals, I think that that's really the first thing. Like if you're going to ask people to do something, make it specific, make it something that can be repetitive. Linda said something really brilliant about how, I think this was right after the midterms, but you know, civic life is really like, it's a muscle that you have to exercise every day or every week. It's not just, you know, you cram everything in at the last minute and you expect to get swole, right? And to me, like voting is like, you know, when everyone's canvassing and trying to get your attention, that's like the last minute thing. This is, you know, who you are, what you value, what you stand for, and how you engage with your community and with political life is something that you can do every week, not just during, you know, election season. And I think when celebrities recognize that and they're not just trying to, you know, to endorse candidates or causes at the last minute, that to me is building a real community around your values.
Thank you. And of course, the research bears out what Sabrina is talking about, that those kind of deep canvassing efforts, that sort of commitments in communities over many months and many years are actually also the most effective ways to engage voters.
Yeah, and I will say that I read one of your recent, one of Circle's recent publications about people not knowing exactly how to engage because, you know, people want to engage with civic life, but they don't have sort of those basic steps or someone showing them this is how you do vote tripling, this is how you get out the vote, right? But I love this idea of, you know, it's more fun to do something when it's Wonder Woman themed. Like put together a Wonder Woman nonpartisan vote for love and justice booklet with Linda and Fandom Forward that outlined those different tactics. And that is something that's shared not just around the election. It's like you can register people to vote at any time.
Of course. Excellent. Okay, so soon we're going to turn it over to the audience, so get ready. And I also should have noted at the beginning that we also have friends on Zoom watching us. So questions, Jess and Shanley will be monitoring for questions that come in on the remote platform as well. But before we turn it over to audience questions, I'd love just to give you a chance, an open-ended chance, an opportunity to mention anything that we haven't covered, maybe some advice you have to the students who are here or that's been given to you that's really been important in your fan journey, but also in your professional career.
Oh, sure. Well, I guess my biggest piece of advice is drink water. That's always pretty good. Drink water and wear sunscreen. In terms of, there was one thing I wanted to say about fandom and why it's so important. I think that fans in particular get laughed off the stage all the time, or people think it's really weird to be like a super fan or to talk about stories in this way. And when people say that, I just say, well, why is Governor DeSantis going to war with Disney World? Why is he talking about what is too woke? And why is he, Disney World recently, if I don't know if you've all heard, but they're kind of like this self-governing, like they have water rights and they have like special tax structures, and like that's another problem. But I think what's alarming about the way that Florida is kind of wresting back control of that is that now there are sort of these ideas that if Disney's content is too woke or considered too woke, the government will punish them for that. And Disney is one of it's like the biggest media entertainment company by a magnitude of, Disney's like number 2 or 3 on the most valuable companies list. And then you have like Sony and all these other companies kind of like down in the 10 to 20 range, right? And these are the companies this is the company that owns Star Wars and Marvel and all of these, the highest ranking franchises of all time. The other thing I wanted to say about what's happening to these stories is that we're all trying to make meaning of them. And they're like the perfect case study. If you're in political science or you're trying to organize people, the best way to do it with stories is to pick the stories that the most people have seen. Like there's this idea that Marvel is a pox on film culture or on, it's making us dumber, but that's a problem for English majors and film majors. You're not Martin Scorsese. If you're a political organizer, Marvel is just fine. So just think about it that way. Like you're not even just speaking to people in this country. Like you might be speaking to someone who comes to this school from China and, they might have like different ideas about what American culture is, but they've probably seen Marvel movies because these movies are popular in all of these different countries. So it's the thing that not only you can communicate to other people with, it's something that you can connect and bond with them emotionally and form friendships and coalition around. And I find that that's a really underrated tool. And also like those, there's so many courses on like the philosophy of Star Wars and Harry Potter and these different stories. And, you often see news stories saying like, oh, this liberal arts college is doing this worthless course on Tolkien, but it's not. They tend to be the most popular courses. They wind up filling up very quickly. And I think that that's a testament to their power. Yeah.
There's some really good ideas for ex-college courses in this talk.
Oh, I would love to teach at the ex-college.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
We're getting some next steps going here.
But in general, a piece of advice. So in my longer bio on my website, I explicitly say that I came from a working class background, and that's very important to me. I know a lot of people, I know the demographics here at the university, it tends to skew like elite and wealthy. And I think that that's great. That's great for you if that's your background. But I think that it's especially important to me that activism and public service and civic life become more accessible to people who, you know, are living paycheck to paycheck or are always worried about money. Like that is not the case for me now, which is great. But like when I was here, that was something I was always thinking about. And Tisch was really, really important to me because I had an unpaid congressional internship that I wouldn't have been able to accept if I hadn't been a part of this program. And the reason I like went on this path of, you know, I started out in FCC, like telecom research right after I graduated. I worked in media, I worked in PR, I'm now with Linda Carter, and I've done fan activism. Those are all elements of like really trying to make something for yourself when you don't have the opportunities that your peers might. And so I think that fan activism is cool too, because we're all about paying people what they're worth, or like trying to pay people and not just passing off like, let's do a lot of unpaid labor, right? Like Fandom Forward does some consulting for like corporations, but we actually bring in the volunteers that we work with who are often like young, like high school aged or college age, or, you know, like young people, and we pay them to do these like facilitator, like we train them and then we pay them, and they teach other people about fan activism and leveraging fandoms for good.
That's amazing. Thank you. We have touched on so many great topics already. What questions or comments do folks in the audience have? Yes, we'll start here.
Hi, thank you so
And
much.
if you could just also, sorry to say, identify yourself, maybe if you're a student, say what year you are.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. My name is Talia, I'm a sophomore. A couple things. One, super excited to be matching Fitbits with someone as cool as you. I wanted to know, like, as a Harry Potter like fan myself, how like your opinions and your activism change when like things come out in the news about like people who suddenly become controversial or like canceled, like with J.K. Rowling and comments, and how that changes your work and your opinions.
Yeah, personally, I with Harry Potter specifically, I had kind of a difficult journey with that because I think the people have very different opinions, you know, within Fandom Forward and in fan activist communities, and there's not, you know, one way to do, you know, to engage with the brand except to say, I'm not enriching J.K. Rowling anymore. I'm not spending money on things that are officially like licensed, you know, Harry Potter merch. I'm not engaging with the brand in that way. One of the things that I really enjoy is like hijacking of brands like that. Like there are trans creators that have created like at Fandom Forward, actually, there's this pin that's like the prefect badge, but it says perfect and it's the trans flag. And there's a publication called the Gaily Prophet that put together a list of things that you can do to be a Harry Potter fan without supporting J.K. Rowling and instead supporting queer and trans creators. And I think that at that level in particular with this story, it's a problem of scale because she's a billionaire, right? And I don't think putting more money in her pocket is good, but I think that like boycotting the brand is so interesting because at the end of the day, it doesn't really do much to shift like the needle, or at least it hasn't at this level. It's still a very, very popular brand. I think that to me personally, a really interesting idea is amplifying those moments where people hijack the brand and they make like trans fan merch and they say like, this character is trans and this is why, and they're creating like fan interpretations. Because to me, as that becomes more popular, is also the thing that's likely to piss her off, which I think is really funny. So yeah, to me, like I always try to think about like what can fans do to like reinterpret and like put their own spin on the story and make the most of it. Because I will say that one of the problems that I see that kind of, it doesn't like help her case because I don't believe in what she's saying, but she gets to say like, oh, trans people are taking something away from you, which is, you know, wrong. But I think the idea of fans saying like this character is trans and her getting upset about it, that's kind of a positive spin, and it teaches fans who maybe don't know anything about trans rights, they've never met a trans person or they think they haven't. Like that's kind of like a different spin on the situation. So that's kind of like my personal take on it rather than an organizational take. But I've also like Lord of the Rings has filled the Harry Potter shaped gap in my heart. And I think that really helps. There are other stories like Percy Jackson and but I think it's hard to give up a world, like it's hard to give up a universe, and I don't want to diminish that for people. I think it's a little bit naive to say like it's just a book, stop reading it. But it's a question of like how do you interpret that story, or how do you move on to something similar?
Thank you. Professor Shulkrat?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so great to hear all this from you. Two related questions. One is there a equivalent type of fan activism on the conservative side that you're aware of? And do you ever have conversations with actors or characters who would like to do more but are afraid of alienating a fan base or backlash? And how do you handle that or kind of nudge them to being more activist?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's something I'm seeing, I think a lot of us are seeing in, I guess, the alt-right or white supremacist movements where young white boys and men are radicalized through video game communities, right? It's not that it specifically has something to do with the stories that are being told through video games, but you see that those kinds of fandoms are communities where you see people sort of targeted in that way. I haven't seen sort of a one-to-one like anti-abortion or anti like LGBTQ rights like fan activist. It's not like this is the same thing on the other side. This is like the Wario and Waluigi of what we're doing, So no, I haven't really seen that. Sorry, what was the second part?
And then actors or characters who
Yeah.
want to do more but are afraid of drawing backlash.
I don't think I've seen anyone I haven't met anyone who was like, who thought like, oh, there's gonna be backlash. Everyone I've met has been really excited about it. I have met and spoken with like Rosario Dawson about that. And she's somehow in like both universes. She's like in Marvel and she has her own Star Wars show. And so when you say fan activism to someone of that, at that level, who's also like an activist, I should say, so she's pretty outspoken, like, yeah, it's really exciting. People have been, for the most part, excited about it. And I should add that fan activism isn't just necessarily political or like partisan activism. It can be like civic, like disaster relief, hunger relief, and all these things that shouldn't seem like they're partisan. It's really like community building and community engagement. So, there are other ways. If you don't want to rock the boat, you can simply do fan activism to feed people in your community, right?
Yeah, right here.
Hi, my name is TJ. I'm a sophomore. Two things. First, this is not a question, but it's funny you mentioned Rosario Dawson. I just watched Friend last night. So anyway, but the question I had was like, what moment, or was there a moment or like a belief you had that like when you first like got into this career, you were like, this is what I want to do? Like, was there like a belief, like something that you have like believed like for a long time that like kind of clicked when you got into like the industry?
Yeah. At a previous job in the last 2 years, I kind of overheard someone say, all she wants to talk about is fandom. and it was kind of like derogatory, right? And I think that's when I realized, oh man, I have something that is so great here. I have a North Star. I have something that I really believe in where it wasn't one, I think that was like maybe the turning point, but I started noticing that I would go to networking events and I would meet people. Like I've met so many celebrities and influencers and people and politicians, and half of me is like I have stars in my eyes, but then the other half of me is like, have you heard about fan activism? Like, what do you think about fandom? Or if you have a fandom, what do you think of your fans? So I just found that I really had carved something interesting for myself, that like I'm in this world of people who live and breathe it, but most people don't, and they don't know anything about it. So yeah, I decided that I was going to be a cheerleader for fan activism, but more broadly, and we didn't really talk about this, but I write about fandom and I study fandom more broadly, not even just the activism, but what's interesting about the way fans engage with pop culture and what kinds of trends, you know, kind of are defining what fandom is today.
Hi, my name's Ishan. I'm a freshman. I had two questions. So the first one I want to ask is that while you can see evidence of fan activism emerging from the more positive aspects of a pop cultural object, but I wanted to ask, have you observed that activism can also observe sometimes from its drawbacks or its more negative aspects? Like for example, with J.K. Rowling, putting transphobic statements on Twitter, do we see like pro-trans rights activism from Harry Potter fans? Or like for example, with the Lord of the Rings, there's evidence that there's, some level of cultural insensitivity, some racist caricatures with regards to the monsters. So do you see activism emerging from that aspect as well against those negative aspects?
Absolutely. To me, that is a problem of representation, and like the answer, other than rallying, one of the things that fans do is they rally for more representation or better representation of particular demographic groups in media, and that is a really popular form of fan activism. But yeah, interpretation has been a really, really important part of bringing more diversity and ending stereotypes in popular media. I mean, I think about things like Black Hermione, which is, this was like a fanon. So fanon is like fan ideas that become canonical because they're so popular. I'm gonna stop talking about Harry Potter so much. Let's talk about Lord of the Rings. So, Tolkien is dead, so he doesn't really, like, his estate can comment on these things, but he can't spar with people about whatever, whatever he would think about this. But, there's no queer representation in Lord of the Rings, but there's a queer subculture of Lord of the Rings where fans interpret Frodo and Sam as being in love, or like that is the true relationship, or Sam has this loving, like, romantic affinity for Frodo, and that's, they sustain each other through this journey together, and that's the love story. And then there's the question, I know there's this wonderful group called Black Nerds Create, and their founder, Biana Davis, I think is a co-host of the Tolkien Black Folks podcast, and that's a show where they talk about interpretations of race in the Tolkien legendarium. And I know Biana has spoken, she was on NPR recently to talk about Black Magical History Month, for example. And one of the things she talks about is what it felt like, what it meant to see Black characters in the new Lord of the Rings of Power show. So yeah, definitely that is something that is very popular in fan activism. And what you said, what was the second question?
Yeah, so like kind of adding off of that, I think, like, I don't know exactly how to frame this, but like with certain pop cultural objects as well, I think there's sort of like a dual lens to which it's seen. Like for example, with like it's clear with, like, for example, the Lord of the Rings TV show, where one part of the fandom was saying that it's great that we have this diversity in the TV show. But the other, the part of the fandom that was saying, oh, it's not loyal to the books, that was, this character wasn't a person of color. But I think also with Avatar, for example, there was a lot of controversy over the new Avatar movie because it's become such a pop cultural kind of icon. Like for example, in 2009 you had Palestinian protesters dressing up as Navi at a protest. But there was also a lot of criticism about cultural appropriation, going so far to say that it was exploitation, romanticizing colonialism. So, where does that kind of come under? Like, what part of it kind of becomes fan activism? I was just curious to know that.
Oh, that's such a good question. I should say I'm not really a huge fan of Avatar. My husband keeps trying to get me to see Avatar 2, and I refuse to, because to me it's like Pocahontas, but James Cameron put it in the it's very fancy, right? High frame rate, and I'm supposed to be impressed by that. So I can't really speak to the situation of the Navi, but yeah, I mean, I think that, again, fan activism is there's such a broad definition. To me, it would be fan activism if fans of this particular franchise, you know, really kind of lobbied James Cameron in a certain way. And they said, you know, like indigenous fans of Avatar said, well, I love this thing about it. I love like these characters, but this representation of indigenous culture, you have it wrong because X, Y, and Z. Like that's where I see fan activism kind of engaging in interpretation of the stories. Going back to what you said about fans who said, you know, there was no Black characters, like characters weren't Black, were like people of color in or Asian, or those people didn't exist in Lord of the Rings, so it didn't make sense. It's a fantasy world. And like also if you say that there's one kind of interpretation, you're missing the point, right? Actually, I wanted to mention this earlier and I didn't, but Tolkien himself believed he wrote this manifesto called On Fairy Stories, and he came up with this concept called subcreation. He was a very Catholic man, so this is a very like kind of really, it's framed by his religious worldview, but there's sort of the idea of the creation of the world is this divine thing, but also to him, telling stories and engaging in imagination is just as divine. And it's like world building. It's people engaging in the divine because they're like adding to the creation of the world through storytelling and world building. My friend who's like a Tolkienologist would say that fandom is like sub creation. So I kind of pulled from that, and I thought, well, what fans are doing to stories, that there's magic in that. There's kind of, I wouldn't say divinity, but there's something that's really important and how we engage with that. So the idea that there's one moral lesson to be learned from Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, I mean, you see people write so many bad essays about what the Scarlet Letter means. You could write anything you want about like the Scarlet Letter. But to me, yeah, there are so many different interpretations.
You have another question, right? Any other questions? Last one, yeah,
I
sure.
just have a comment. I'm Nancy, I live in the community. Kept thinking of fans, like in the old days, say the Rolling Stones concert, you had the groupies, that would sort of hang out backstage and they'd be screaming.
It's the parasocial relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, so, but then, how do you say it? I don't think they would have gotten into, how do you say it? Doing like good world projects, or, what I mean? They were just there, I think, just for the music, and their stars were in their eyes and they were excited about the performance. But I don't think, it just makes me compare, like say 30, 40 years ago. I don't think people went that extra yard to say, make a tangent and to do some public service out of that or something.
I think that maybe our engagement with media has changed a lot in the last 40, 50 years. Like, I learned this at Tufts. There was a professor who taught, I can't remember exactly what the course was called, but it was like the difference between hot media and cold media. And one was like, you're watching television and you're consuming, and Walter Cronkite is telling you what the news is. And now media is the opposite of that. I think, that's the cold media, and the hot media, please correct me if I'm wrong. And I think the hot media is like, you are commenting on what Walter Cronkite, the great social media expert, would say. If Walter Cronkite is doing like a broadcast on Facebook Live, do you guys know who Walter Cronkite is? I hope so. The point is, like, everything is much more interactive now, and everyone has their own interpretation. I think that, like I said, in the 60s, there were the Star Trek fans who not only had these letter writing campaigns that they did, but they wrote zines. Like, zines existed at that time, and they would, that was where the fanon of Kirk and Spock being a romantic couple came from that era and from those kinds of interpretations. So it's not to say that it didn't exist, but it's just become more popular and more relevant to how we engage with media now.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And thank you for being here, for joining us in person and online. great kickoff to the semester. Thank you so much, Sabrina. And I know Sabrina can stick around for a little bit and talk to anyone or answer any questions. So thank you very much.